Let's talk about the history of racialized profiling of Mexican Americans and other Latino immigrants in the United States. The criminalization of Mexican Americans and other Latino immigrants has a long history that doesn't get talked about often. Brignoni-Ponce is a Supreme Court case that raised the question, is racialized profiling reasonable suspicion to investigate, arrest, and detain someone? What exactly is the Supreme Court case, the United States versus Brignoni-Ponce? On March 11, 1973, Mr. Brignoni-Ponce was stopped by Border Patrol agents due to his Mexican appearance and caught transporting undocumented individuals, where he was then arrested and eventually tried. On his criminal trial, his attorney cited violation of his Fourth Amendment rights, which states that search and seizure without a warrant needs probable cause. His argument was based on the exclusionary rule that any evidence gathered from an unconstitutional search would be dismissed. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that a Mexican appearance is not reasonable and probable cause for Border Patrol cars stopping vehicles, and that under the exclusionary rule, all evidence was gathered illegally. The United States to the Supreme Court on October 15, 1974, based their argument on certain parts of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which authorizes agents to interrogate individuals believed to be undocumented and warrantless searches within a reasonable distance from the border. Justice Powell issued the court's majority opinion, which held that the Fourth Amendment requires reasonable suspicion for stopping and interrogating a vehicle and its passengers. In order to understand this case in 1974, you need to understand the historical context of Border Patrol expansion. Let's go back to the Bracero program of 1942. If you weren't aware, during World War II, internment camps for people of Japanese ancestry were created that caused a labor shortage in farms. To resolve this, after a series of diplomatic agreements between the U.S. and Mexico, the U.S. permitted millions of Mexican men to work legally in the United States on short-term labor contracts. This excluded the state of Texas between 1942 to 1947 because discrimination against Mexicans was horrific. The term wetback originated from Texas and referred to Mexicans who illegally entered Texas by crossing the Rio Grande. The U.S. agreed Braceros would be protected from discrimination and low wages, but that didn't last long. Braceros were upcharged for housing, experienced reduced pay, and were exposed to deadly chemicals. By the time the program ended in 1964, the program brought more than 4 million Braceros to work in the U.S., agriculture, and railroads. Operation Wetback was from 1953 to 1954 and is considered the largest mass deportation in American history. In the 1950s, the federal government deported as many as 1.3 million people, including Americans, back to Mexico with the help of the Mexican government. This was to help alleviate the labor shortage in Mexico, but in the U.S., Mexicans were portrayed as dirty, disease-bearing, irresponsible people. The belief that Mexicans came to the U.S. to steal jobs from Americans spread despite the fact that many were invited to work here through the Bracero program. This was exacerbated by South Texas farmers who refused to participate in the Bracero program and got paid less wages for their labor than farmers who complied. Harlan B. Carter was the head of the Border Patrol who had a former murder conviction of killing a Latino as a teen, and he convinced President Eisenhower to increase immigration enforcement. Since the National Guard isn't used to enforce domestic laws, Border Patrol efforts increased through military tactics and propaganda. The 1960s and 70s saw the civil rights movement in the U.S., and with that came the Hart-Celler Act, also known as the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965. This act is said to have reformed immigration laws. The act prioritized skilled workers and family reunification in the immigrant process and allowed for 270,000 immigrants to enter annually, with each nation being allowed to send 20,000 people a year. Before 1965, immigration from Mexico and other Latin American countries was unrestricted, and this was largely due to the Bracero program that allowed for legal working in the United States. With a new cap of 20,000 per nation, this didn't stop the incoming Mexican migrants. It's important to note that the workers of the Bracero program were never granted citizenship, so they went from legal and temporary to permanent and undocumented as soon as the Immigration and Nationality Act passed. As Isabel Skilton states in her paper about race-based immigration enforcement as a result of Brignoni-Ponce Supreme Court landmark case, quote, "The unauthorized or undocumented Mexican immigrant has taken on the stereotype of a criminal. This stereotype is not only factually incorrect, but it also stems from policies such as the Hart-Celler Act that arbitrarily criminalized patterns of migration that communities had relied on for years. Brignoni-Ponce is significant because the court identified 8 factors supporting reasonable suspicion for Border Patrol stops, including area characteristics, proximity to border, traffic patterns, agent experience, recent crossings, the driver's behavior, the vehicle's aspects, and passenger characteristics, but held that stops based solely on apparent ancestry violate the Fourth Amendment. The law can claim neutrality while operating on discrimination. While the Supreme Court ruled that stops based on apparent ancestry violated the Fourth Amendment, the law still filters who belongs based on racialized assumptions. Reasonable suspicion being the driver's behavior, vehicle aspects, and passenger characteristics just makes Latino identity grounds for surveillance. This leads to part 2 of this video. Brignoni-Ponce did not create racialized policing because it constitutionalized a system that already existed. Hernandez versus Texas of 1954 explains why that was possible. Perdomo versus Noam in 2025 shows that it never ended and it's still going on today.